Former Food and Drug Administration Commissioner Scott Gottlieb called for expanded regulations on risky research, such as that of the coronavirus, regardless of whether it leaked from a lab. Here he is on CBS's Face the Nation.
We're still stuck on the debate about whether it was or wasn't a lab leak. I don't think we're going to prove that. I think we should work on the assumption that there's a probability that it was a lab leak and start putting in place the kinds of protections that we need.
He also added that maybe gain-of-function research should not be outsourced to China. Perhaps it should be nixed entirely.
We need to get the intelligence agencies engaged in this as a part of their national security mission, and look at public health preparedness through a national security lens. I think we're doing that now, but we need to be very explicit about that. And that does mean also surveillance around some of the high-risk activities that can create these kinds of risks.
Meanwhile, House Judiciary Committee Chairman Jim Jordan isn't letting anyone slide. He told Fox News' Maria Bartiromo he wants answers about where the virus came from and who was responsible for possibly covering up all the facts. Here he is on Fox News' Sunday Morning Futures.
Dr. Gary's email says, I don't know how this happens in nature. It would be easy to do in a lab. That same day, February 1st, 2020. So again, right at the start, that same day, Dr. Fauci organizes a conference call. Him and Dr. Collins get on there with Dr. Gary, Dr. Anderson, all these other virologists. They get on there, and 3 days later, everybody changes their story. The same guy who said this would be easy to do in a lab says, "Oh, now you're crazy if you think it came from a lab." The same guy that says, "I don't know how this looks engineered," he changes his story. And then the kicker is, 3 months later, those same two doctors, Dr. Anderson and Dr. Gary, get a several million-dollar grant from Dr. Fauci to continue their research. So the fundamental question is, why was Dr. Fauci so consumed with making sure the narrative wasn't about the lab? I think it's because they were doing gain-of-function research there. He didn't want that out. And that was the narrative that everyone on the left bought into, even though the facts and common sense, maybe most importantly, pointed to the lab leak theory.
So Scott Gottlieb, saying that he thinks it probably is a lab leak, he leans in that direction at least, but it really doesn't matter. I mean, it matters, but we're not going to know anytime in the immediate future. But we should proceed as if that is what happened and take all necessary precautions. And I'm hearing this and thinking, yeah, why weren't we taking all necessary precautions in the first place? Why did government scientists think risky research, not following necessary safety protocols, being outsourced to China under the purview of an authoritarian government that is not transparent and does not participate or admit wrongdoing? This was a recipe for disaster in the first place.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to point out, I found that interview with Jim Jordan really interesting. I think it's important to note, this is why he didn't want to be nominated to be Speaker of the House. He was very clear that he was very invested in these investigations. He was very invested in getting to the bottom of COVID and holding people to account, people like Dr. Fauci. And in this interview, I think he was very measured. I mean, he was not throwing flames. There was no trolling. It seemed to me very moderate, very appropriate, and exactly kind of what you need, which is somebody who's doggedly pursuing the truth in this issue and then trying to represent what the American people want in terms of steps forward for keeping us safe.
Right. And they want answers to this, of course. I keep talking about the mainstream media's sudden, and they can't deny it anymore. Now that there is, enough reason to think that at least the lab leak is just as plausible as the alternative. Some agencies have reached one conclusion, but now increasingly agents of the federal government are concluding that, with low confidence, but possibly it was a lab leak, and now the media has had to cover it for these past 2 weeks, as if for the first time, as if they just heard this idea, but actually they vigorously suppressed this idea for a year, for more than a year. Their thunderous accusations of conspiracy and racism against people who were just mildly asking whether it was possible. It's really some chickens coming home to roost now, I think, because they can't take that tact anymore. At least they're not trying so much. But I'm really struck by this whole misinformation, disinformation framing that is just, it's what we're living under. How that is now the excuse for every news outlet or mainstream publication or elite cabal to silence speech or to silence everyday Americans all stems from a concern that they're going to hear information that the elite consensus thinks is wrong, but just time and time again, it proves out that the consensus itself was wrong, or at least it's more confusing than, or more open to interpretation than any of them thought. And yet we go through this. Well, I'm sure this is going to happen again. There's going to be some other story. They say, no, you can't. Anyone talking about this, racist conspiracy theorist. Why isn't Facebook doing more to crack down on this? This is how it always goes. There's stories in the New York Times and the Washington Post and on MSNBC and CNN. They're railing against social media allowing conversations like this to take place. And then a year later, it's like, oops, well, I guess you should have been able to discuss this. Oh, well.
So there was a really great example of that on, I don't know if you watched Bill Maher this weekend. He had on Russell Brand and someone from MSNBC, John Heilman. And so Bill Maher, who was a big skeptic about COVID extremism from the beginning, and Russell Brand, who of course has taken that to a whole new level in his Rumble show, they were sort of, so Bill Maher said, doesn't this now prove the skeptics correct, that it's all coming out? And John Heilman from MSNBC said, well, the problem with the lab leak theory was from the beginning that Donald Trump mentioned it in the context of racism. He said Kung flu virus, and then he said China virus, and then he said lab leak. So he tainted the theory with racism, and then all of us couldn't believe in it, something along those lines. And it was so funny because, of course, the reason they turned on the lab leak theory was because Donald Trump suggested it was true. But that is an indictment of them. It's not an indictment of Donald Trump. You can't smear the truth as racist with a joke, right? That was on them, but he still can't see that. In his mind, they were still correct.
Mehdi Hassan, another host on MSNBC, said the exact same thing on Twitter last week, and I responded to him, and I pushed back, and then he said, I think he said that I was an anti-Fauci conspiracist or something like that. Again, because just saying that. Isn't it important to understand how we got this so wrong? When Fauci is this foremost advocate of doing this research and said, I'm anti-Fauci conspiracy theorist. There you go. But yeah, it's just as you said. You can also you can condemn Trump for saying Kung flu or China virus or any of those things. You can say that's not appropriate. Fine, whatever. That's two things can be the same at once. That Trump had a not appropriate or not appropriate to the moment or for the cadence of a world leader, and also it was correct
Trump
to think it was a lab leak, right?
Right.
Yeah,
no, but I think that it really drove home the point you're making, Robby, which is that so often they use the accusation of racism to cover up a class divide that they and the credentialed elites are benefiting from and imposing on people and demanding that other people pay for, which is, of course, what so much of the COVID extremism was all about.
Yeah. All right, well, we'll have more Rising right after this. Stay with us.